Corporal Vance choked on his own vomit 3 meters from where I crouched behind the sandbag wall. The sound of it came wet and thick, a gurgling expulsion that went on too long, and when he finally stopped I could smell it even through the chemical reek of last discharge and burning promethium that hung over the siege lines. Sour milk and copper. Something else underneath, something that made my throat close up before my brain could name it. Vance had been complaining about stomach cramps since yesterday. Command told him to keep firing. Sergeant Aldrich Brennan grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back toward the firebase just as another artillery shell from the enemy bastions screamed overhead. The concussion wave punched through my chest even at this distance, and debris pattered down around us like diseased rain. Somewhere to my left, a heavy bolter opened up, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump marking time against the chaos. 43 days we had been bleeding ourselves against the walls of Mouthra's fortress, 43 days of grinding attrition, while the bastards behind those ferrocrete ramparts laughed and spat death down on us. The 47th Corvan Rifles had started this siege with 4,000 souls. I had stopped counting how many remained after day 22 because the numbers made my hands shake. The fortress belonged to a petty tyrant who had declared himself free of the imperial tithe. Standard reclamation action, they told us during the briefings. 6 weeks at most before the walls cracked, and we could flood in to remind these faithless dogs what it meant to deny the God Emperor his due. Standard reclamation action. That morning, everything still made a kind of terrible sense. Men died because men always died in the Guard, and the enemy held because that was what enemies did until they no longer could. The shells fell. The lasguns cracked. The wounded screamed for medics who never came fast enough. War as I had known it through 11 campaigns and 26 years of service. Then Corporal Vance stopped vomiting and started laughing. Private Tolliver was the first to notice something wrong. He had been assigned to evacuation detail, dragging the wounded back from the forward trenches to the field stations behind our lines. I saw him freeze mid-step as he passed Vance, his face going the color of old bone. The stretcher he carried dipped dangerously, nearly spilling its groaning cargo into the mud. Vance was sitting up. His uniform was soaked through with bile and something darker, brownish-red streaks that had seeped through the fabric of his flak armor. His eyes were open but wrong somehow, too wide, the pupils blown out until almost no color remained around them, and he was laughing, not the laugh of a man who had heard a joke or found some grim humor in our situation. This was the laugh of a child who had discovered a secret too wonderful to contain, a high and bubbling thing that made my skin crawl. Tolliver said something. A question, probably. I was too far away to hear the words, but I saw his mouth move, saw him take a hesitant step forward. Vance grabbed him by the throat. What happened next took maybe 4 seconds. Tolliver dropped the stretcher. His hands came up, clawing at the grip around his neck. Vance surged to his feet with a strength that made no sense for a man who had been doubled over and retching moments before. He pulled Tolliver close, almost tender, like a lover moving in for a kiss. Then he bit through Tolliver's cheek and tore away a fist-sized chunk of meat. The screaming started. Not just Tolliver, whose gargling shrieks cut off abruptly as Vance went for his throat a second time. Other men nearby, soldiers who had seen years of combat and watched friends die in every conceivable way, now scrambling backward with naked terror on their faces. Someone fired a lasgun, the shot going wide and scorching a black streak across a supply crate. I raised my own weapon, sighting down the barrel at the thing that had been Corporal Vance. He looked up from his meal, blood and worse dripping from his chin, and for one horrible moment our eyes met. He smiled at me, genuinely smiled like we shared a secret. My finger found the trigger. The first bolt caught him in the shoulder and spun him half around. The second punched through his chest, center mass, a killing shot that should have dropped any man. He staggered, looked down at the smoking hole in his torso with what might have been mild curiosity, and kept coming. Sergeant Brennan appeared beside me, his own weapon adding its voice to mine. We poured fire into Vance until his body came apart, until he stopped moving and lay in a spreading pool of fluids too dark to be purely blood. Even then, I kept my lasgun trained on him for another 30 seconds, waiting for him to rise again. He did not, but others did. The wounded man on the dropped stretcher sat up at some point during the firefight. Nobody noticed until he had already torn out the throat of the medic trying to help him. Across the trench line, 3 more soldiers, who had been declared dead or dying within the last 12 hours, opened their eyes and began to move with that same terrible purpose. By midday, we had lost the forward trenches, not to the enemy artillery or the sorties from the fortress gates. We lost them to our own dead. Command established a secondary perimeter 200 meters back from the original siege lines. General Castor addressed us via Vox, his voice crackling through speakers mounted on the command vehicles. He called it a tactical redeployment necessitated by unexpected enemy biological weapons. He assured us that the situation was contained and that reinforcements were being requested through proper channels. Nobody believed him. The smell hit us first, before the visual confirmation. A creeping miasma that rolled down from the abandoned trenches like fog off a winter river. It was the smell of Corporal Vance multiplied 1,000-fold. Rotting meat and festering wounds, yes, but something else beneath it. Something sweet and cloying that made my eyes water and my stomach heave. A perfume of corruption that seemed to coat the inside of my nose and throat, no matter how I tried to breathe through my mouth. Sergeant Brennan handed me a rag soaked in promethium fuel. The chemical stink of it was harsh enough to cut through the worst of the rot, though it made me dizzy after a few minutes. Better dizzy than smelling that. We could see them moving out there in the dying light of the afternoon. Figures that had been our brothers in arms hours before, now shambling between the foxholes and weapon emplacements we had bled to construct. They moved with a kind of purpose that made no tactical sense, clustering together in groups, sometimes stopping to tear at each other before continuing on. Their wounds did not slow them. Men missing limbs dragged themselves forward. Bodies with half their organs exposed kept walking until their legs gave out, and even then they crawled, and the fortress had gone silent. That was the thing that made me realize how deep we had fallen into the pit. For 43 days the enemy bastions had spat fire and death at us without pause. Artillery, autocannons, las batteries. Now the walls stood dark and quiet, the gun emplacements empty or unmanned. Private Gentry, a young soldier from Corva Prime who had only joined us 3 months prior, voiced what we were all thinking. The enemy did not need to fight us anymore. Whatever they had unleashed in those trenches was doing the work for them. Sergeant Brennan told him to shut up and check his ammunition count. The first assault came at dusk. They poured out of the abandoned trenches in a wave, dozens of them, their ruined bodies silhouetted against the orange glow of burning supply dumps. They did not scream or shout battle cries. They simply came, silent except for the wet sounds of their footsteps and the grinding of joints that should no longer function. We cut them down with disciplined volleys, las fire sweeping across the killing field in patterns we had drilled 1,000 times. Bodies fell, but not all of them stayed down. Some rose again within seconds. Others took longer, minutes ticking past while we focused on other threats, only to have a corpse we had written off suddenly lunge at our firing lines. The head, we learned. You had to destroy the head. Not just damage it, not just wound it, but utterly obliterate the skull and everything inside. Anything less was temporary at best. By full dark, we had lost another 40 men. Some to the attackers who had been our comrades. Some to the sickness that spread through the camp with every bite, every scratch, every splash of corrupted blood. The dead did not stay dead, and the dying did not have time to say goodbye before they became something else. I found a quiet moment between attacks and slumped against an ammunition crate, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking again, but not from the numbers this time. From exhaustion, from the constant acid burn of fear in my gut, from the smell that no amount of promethium could mask anymore. That was when I saw the symbol. It had been carved into the crate at some point, the cuts fresh enough that the wood around them still showed pale against the weathered grey of the exterior. 7 circles arranged in a triangle pattern, 3 on the bottom, 2 in the middle, 1 at the top, with a 7th in the center connecting them all. I did not recognize it, but something about the shape made my skin crawl in a way I could not explain. I asked Brennan about it later, during the brief lull before the next wave. He looked at the marking, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Brennan had served in the Skara sector 20 years back, during an action that was never officially recorded. He told me about it now, his voice barely above a whisper. A plague had swept through an agri-world there, something the local ecclesiarchy had called the grandfather's blessing. The dead rose, the living rotted, and everywhere the sickness spread, that symbol appeared. He told me to burn the crate and everything around it, then to burn my gloves for good measure. I did not ask what the symbol meant. The look on his face made it clear that knowing would not help me sleep any better. The night stretched on without end. Waves of the dead crashed against our lines in no predictable pattern, sometimes hours apart, sometimes mere minutes. We burned through ammunition at a terrifying rate, and the supply officers stopped answering requests after the 3rd hour. Either they had been overrun, or they had simply stopped caring. General Castor made another address around midnight. His voice had changed. The professional confidence was gone, replaced by something thinner, more desperate. He ordered us to hold our positions until reinforcements arrived. He did not specify when that would be. Gentry, who had been manning a heavy stubber next to me, started laughing at that. It was not a good laugh. It reminded me too much of Vance. I kept him in my peripheral vision for the rest of the night. Dawn brought no relief. The sky lightened from black to a sickly grey that never quite achieved true morning. Clouds hung low and heavy, their bellies the color of old bruises, and a persistent drizzle began to fall that smelled faintly of copper. The rain stung where it touched bare skin. Small welts rose on the hands of soldiers who did not cover themselves quickly enough. Someone said it was acid from the burning promethium stores mixing with the clouds. Someone else said it was the corruption itself, falling from the sky now that the ground was so thoroughly tainted. I pulled my hood low and tried not to think about it. The dead had retreated with the dawn, pulling back toward the abandoned trenches and the silent fortress beyond. Through my magnoculars I could see them milling about in the no-man's land, their movements almost lazy now. Some sat down in the mud and simply waited. Others picked at their own bodies, pulling away strips of rotting flesh and examining them with what might have been curiosity. New ones had joined them during the night. I recognized faces among the shambling crowd. Corporal Hendricks, who had shared his rations with me during the 2nd week when supplies ran short. Private UN, barely 18, who had cried for his mother after his first real engagement. Medicae Sergeant Cole, whose steady hands had stitched me back together twice before. They looked back at me across the distance. I could feel their eyes even if I could not make out their features clearly through the rain. Brennan gathered the survivors of our platoon for a briefing. 23 of us remained from an original 60. He laid out the tactical situation with the same flat professionalism he always used, but I could see the muscles in his jaw working as he spoke. We were cut off. The main supply route had been overrun during the night when a field hospital behind the lines went dark and its occupants rose en masse. The reinforcements Castor had promised were not coming because the astropathic choir had stopped transmitting hours ago and nobody knew why. We had ammunition for perhaps 2 more major engagements, food and water for 3 days if rationed carefully, and no clear path of retreat. The fortress, he noted, remained silent. No movement on the walls. no signals from within. Whatever had happened to the defenders was either complete or ongoing, but either way, they were not a factor anymore. Someone asked about the sealed bunker. I had forgotten about that. The command bunker dug into a hillside half a kilometer behind our original positions, where General Castor and his senior staff had retreated when the first signs of trouble appeared. It was hardened against void attack, sealed with reinforced doors, equipped with its own air filtration and water reclamation. If anyone had survived the night, they would be in there. Brennan said he would look into it. His expression suggested he did not expect to find anything good. The second day of the outbreak passed in a blur of violence and terror. The dead came in smaller groups now, but more frequently, testing our perimeter from different angles. They learned, or something controlling them learned, probing attacks to identify weak points, followed by concentrated rushes against our thinnest sections. We lost another 15 soldiers by nightfall, some to the enemy, some to the sickness that now spread through coughs and open wounds, not just bites. The infected did not turn immediately anymore. They walked among us for hours, sometimes half a day, before the fever took hold and their eyes changed. I started watching everyone's eyes. Gentry's laugh got worse. He stopped eating, said the food smelled wrong, said everything smelled wrong now, like the whole world had started to rot from the inside. He might have been right. The sealed bunker remained silent despite repeated Vox attempts. Brennan took a small team to investigate on the evening of the second day. I volunteered to go with them, less from bravery than from a desperate need to be doing something other than waiting to die behind sandbag walls. The path took us through territory we had held just 48 hours before. Now it was a graveyard, littered with bodies we did not have time to burn and equipment we could not afford to salvage. The dead watched us pass. They did not attack, which was somehow worse than if they had. One of them spoke as we crept through what had been a vehicle depot. A body I did not recognize, so badly decomposed that its original features were impossible to determine, turned its head to track our movement and opened what remained of its mouth. "Grandfather welcomes you," it said. The voice was not human, too deep, too resonant, like multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. "He asks only that you accept his gifts." Brennan put a bolt through its skull before it could say more. We moved faster after that, fear lending speed to our steps. The bunker entrance emerged from the hillside like a wound, the reinforced doors that should have been sealed tight now hanging open. Scratches marked the metal around the frame, deep gouges that looked like they had been made from the inside. The smell hit us first. The same smell that had haunted the trenches since the outbreak began, but concentrated now, thickened into something almost physical. I gagged through my promethium-soaked rag and had to brace myself against the doorframe to keep from falling. Brennan went in first, then Corporal Davenport, then me. The bunker was designed to hold 30 personnel for extended operations. We found 47 bodies inside. They had not risen. That was the first thing I noticed, the thing that made this somehow worse than the horrors outside. These soldiers had died and stayed dead, their corpses piled in the corners of the main chamber like cordwood. Many had been partially eaten. Some showed signs of having been dead for days, their flesh in advanced stages of decay that should not have been possible given the timeline. General Castor was seated at his command station, his body slumped forward over the console. His hands had been bound to the chair with wire, the metal cutting deep into his wrists. Someone had opened his belly while he was still alive, spread his organs across the desk in a pattern I recognized, 7 circles, 3 on the bottom, 2 in the middle, 1 on top, 1 in the center. The Vox unit next to him crackled with static, then resolved into a voice. "Children of the corpse god," it said. That same impossible chorus of tones, speaking directly into the bunker's communication system. "You've resisted the grandfather's love for so long. He admires your tenacity. He offers you rest now. True rest in his garden, where nothing ever truly ends and suffering becomes joy. Brennan destroyed the Vox unit with the butt of his rifle. The voice kept speaking anyway, now emerging from the walls themselves, from the ventilation system, from somewhere deeper than any of us wanted to think about. Your siege was never meant to succeed. This world was ours before the first shell fell. We simply waited for you to bleed yourselves against our walls, to weaken and sicken, to become ready for the blessing. Now the garden grows, and you will tend it. I ran. I am not ashamed to admit it. Brennan and Davenport followed, and we sprinted back through the corrupted territory toward our failing perimeter as the dead around us began to stir with renewed purpose. The voice followed us. It came from the mouths of corpses we passed, from the moaning wind, from the wet sounds of rain striking tainted earth. It promised us peace. It promised us freedom from pain. It told us that our brothers who had already turned were happier now than they had ever been in service to the false emperor. I tried not to listen. I tried to focus on my breathing, on my footsteps, on the back of Brennan's head as he led us through the nightmare landscape, but the words sank in anyway, burrowing into my skull like parasites. We reached the perimeter to find it already breached. The dead had not waited for full dark this time. They came in daylight, shambling through the rain in numbers we could not have held even at full strength. Our lines were collapsing, soldiers falling back in disordered clusters, the disciplined firing patterns replaced by panicked bursts of las fire and desperate hand-to-hand combat. Brennan gathered what remained of us, 19 souls now, counting the survivors of the bunker expedition. He did not waste words on speeches or reassurances. He simply pointed toward the eastern ridge, the only direction that did not crawl with the dead, and told us to move. We ran. The retreat, if you could call it that, took us through 3 kilometers of hostile terrain. The rain intensified, the drops now large enough and acidic enough to raise blisters on exposed skin. Some of us had managed to salvage ponchos or cloaks. Others wrapped their heads in rags and prayed to the emperor for deliverance that did not come. Private Gentry stopped running about halfway through. He sat down in the mud, tilted his head back to let the corrupted rain wash over his face, and started laughing again. The sound of it chased us until we could no longer hear it over our own ragged breathing. I do not know when I noticed the wound on my arm. It was small. A scratch, really, the kind of minor injury you pick up a dozen times a day during active combat and never think about. This one ran along my left forearm, maybe 4 centimeters long, the edges already crusted with dried blood. I did not remember receiving it. In the chaos of the last 48 hours, that meant nothing. I had probably caught myself on barbed wire or scraped against debris during one of the countless moments when I was too focused on survival to notice minor pain. But the scratch was not healing the way it should. The edges had gone dark, not the brownish scab of normal clotting, but something greener, more organic. When I pressed the skin around it, I felt a warmth that did not match my body temperature, and a pressure that suggested something moving beneath the surface. I did not tell Brennan, I did not tell anyone. What good would it do? We had no Medicaid, no supplies, no way to treat an infection of this nature even if we had. All I could do was pull my sleeve down over the wound and keep moving. The eastern ridge offered a brief respite. The ground rose steeply here, rocky and exposed, and the dead seemed to have difficulty with the incline. We could see them gathering at the base of the slope, hundreds of them now, their numbers swelling as more of the fallen rose to join the horde. They watched us with those empty, hungry eyes but did not pursue. Not yet. Brennan set up a defensive position on the high ground and began assessing our situation. Ammunition critically low, food and water gone entirely, left behind in the mad scramble to escape. 17 soldiers remaining, 3 of them showing early symptoms of the infection but still functional enough to hold a weapon. The scratch on my arm itched constantly now. I had stopped looking at it after the second time, when I noticed the small white things wriggling just beneath the skin. From the ridge we could see the full scope of the disaster. The siege camp that had housed thousands of Imperial Guard was now a churning mass of corruption. Vehicles burned, supply dumps exploded as fire reached their contents, and everywhere, the dead walked among the ruins of our ambitions. The fortress stood silent and dark, its walls no longer menacing but somehow triumphant. Whatever had been hiding behind those gates had achieved its purpose without ever needing to engage us directly. We had broken ourselves against the trap, bled ourselves dry, and now the survivors were merely loose ends to be swept up at leisure. Brennan found me as dusk approached, my back against a boulder, my good hand pressed over the wound that had started speaking to me in whispers I pretended not to hear. He did not mention my arm. He had noticed. I could see it in his eyes, the way they flickered down to where my sleeve bulged slightly with swelling that should not exist. But he said nothing about it because there was nothing to say. Instead, he talked about the mission we had never completed. The fortress remained untaken. The tyrant inside, if he still lived, had won a victory that would echo across the subsector. When the relief forces finally arrived, they would find only the dead and whatever the dead had become. Unless someone reached the walls first. I understood what he was asking. A suicide mission through territory controlled by the enemy, carrying whatever makeshift explosives we could salvage to breach the gates that had defied us for 43 days, not to take the fortress anymore, but to deny it to the things that now claimed this world. Scorched earth, the final option when all others have failed. I told him I would go. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, thicker than it should have been, and I realized my tongue had started to swell slightly in my mouth. The infection was spreading faster now. Brennan nodded. No gratitude, no sympathy, just acknowledgement that I was already dead and might as well be useful in my final hours. We assembled what we could. 3 melter charges from the heavy weapons team, their operators long since turned. A satchel of frag grenades, 2 flamers with barely enough fuel to matter, and 4 volunteers besides myself, soldiers who had seen the writing on the wall and chosen to die on their feet rather than turn into one of the shambling horrors below. Corporal Davenport was among them, so was Private Yuen's brother, a man named Tomas who had not spoken since discovering his sibling among the dead. The others I knew only by face, their names lost in the shuffle of attrition and terror. We descended the ridge as full dark fell, moving as quietly as 5 soldiers burdened with explosives could manage. The dead did not react at first. They stood in their clusters, swaying gently, their attention focused on something we could not perceive. Then they began to part. A path opened through the horde, a corridor of still and silent bodies that led directly toward the fortress gates. The dead watched us with something that might have been anticipation, their ruined faces tracking our movement but making no move to stop us. The voice returned, now speaking from every throat around us in that terrible chorus. The grandfather welcomes his newest children. Walk the path he has prepared. Enter his garden and know the joy of endless decay. Every instinct told me to stop, to turn back, to fight, rather than accept this obscene invitation. But the wound on my arm burned with a heat that spread through my entire body, and somewhere deep in my skull a pressure was building that made it hard to think clearly. The fortress gates had been destroyed from the inside. The massive doors that had withstood our heaviest ordnance now lay scattered in fragments, blown outward by explosions that had originated in the courtyard beyond. The path led through them without obstruction. We entered the fortress of the enemy and found that the enemy was already gone. The courtyard was a slaughterhouse. Bodies of soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms lay heaped against the walls, their weapons still in their hands, their final moments frozen on their faces. They had not turned. Whatever protection they had been promised, whatever deal they had struck with the powers that corrupted this world, it had not extended to preservation. They were simply dead, truly dead, and from their midst rose structures that had not been there when the siege began. Organic growths that pulsed with sickly light, their surfaces slick with fluids that smelled of the same sweet corruption we had learned to associate with the plague. They spread across the walls, up the towers, transforming the cold stone of the fortress into something living and aware. At the center of the courtyard, where the tyrant's throne room should have stood, a pit had opened in the earth. It descended beyond the reach of our loom sticks, a spiraling wound in reality that breathed with the rhythm of some vast and ancient heart. The voice spoke one final time, emerging from the pit itself. "You have carried my gifts this far. Now deliver them to the garden below, where they will take root and bloom. Go, children. Your journey ends here and your service begins." I looked at Davenport, at Tomas, at the others whose names I had never learned. They looked back at me with eyes that had started to change, pupils dilating beyond what should have been possible, the first signs of the transformation taking hold. My own vision had begun to blur at the edges. The wound on my arm had spread, green tendrils now visible beneath the skin of my chest, working their way toward my heart with patient determination. We had come to destroy the fortress. We had brought explosives, enough to bring down the gates, to collapse the walls, to deny this place to the enemy. The enemy no longer wanted the fortress. The enemy wanted us. I fumbled with the melter charge, my fingers thick and clumsy, the infection stealing my fine motor control even as it sharpened my other senses to painful clarity. I could smell everything now. The rot of the dead around us, yes, but also the living corruption that spread through my own flesh, the sweet promise of oblivion that whispered through every cell. The arming mechanism was simple. Twist, pull, throw. 3 seconds to detonation, enough time to reach the pit if I ran. I did not run. Instead, I pressed the charge against my chest, feeling its cold weight against skin that had stopped being entirely mine. The tendrils beneath my flesh recoiled from the contact, as if sensing the threat, and for one moment the pressure in my skull lifted enough for me to think clearly. Davenport saw what I was doing. He had just enough humanity left to understand, to make the same choice with his own charge. Tomas followed a heartbeat later, and then the others, each of us pressing explosives against bodies that were already dying in ways worse than fire could manage. The voice in the pit changed tone. Surprise, perhaps, or anger. We detonated together. The blast tore through the courtyard, through the organic growths, through the pit that led down to whatever garden of horrors awaited below. Fire and shrapnel and the fury of weapons designed to kill tanks scoured the corruption from the stones, collapsed the towers inward, sealed the wound in reality with the only medicine that worked against such infections. I should have died in that moment. By every law of physics and biology, I should have been scattered across the ruins, my sacrifice complete. Instead, I woke in the rain. The fortress was burning. Flames rose higher than the walls had ever stood, fed by the organic material that had infested every surface. The pit was gone, buried under tons of collapsed stone, and the voice that had spoken from its depths had fallen silent. I was lying in the mud 50 meters from the gatehouse, my body broken in ways I could feel but not fully comprehend. The melter charge had detonated against my chest, and yet my chest remained, scorched and blackened but intact. The infection was still there. I could feel it, weakened but not destroyed, the tendrils retreating deeper into my tissue to escape the damage on the surface. Whatever protection it offered against fire and blast had saved me from the death I had chosen. I tried to rise and found that my legs no longer responded to my commands. Around me, the dead had stopped moving. The horde that had parted to allow our passage now lay still, truly still, their animating force apparently linked to whatever had resided in that pit. Bodies littered the ground in drifts, no longer a threat but a monument to the scope of the disaster. How many thousands had died here? How many more would die as the corruption spread beyond this single world, carried by survivors who did not yet know they were hosts? I dragged myself away from the burning fortress using only my arms, my ruined legs trailing behind me. The infection pulsed with each movement, feeding on my exertion, growing stronger as I grew weaker. I could feel it reaching for my heart now, no longer content to wait. "Grandfather is patient," something whispered from inside my own skull. "His garden extends beyond a single world. You will plant seeds wherever you go, and they will bloom in time." I stopped crawling. The rain continued to fall, no longer burning, the worst of the corruption having concentrated itself in the fortress that now blazed behind me. In my pocket, I found the last frag grenade. Standard issue, nothing special, the kind of weapon that would barely scratch a fortified position. It would be enough. The infection fought me as I armed it, tendrils wrapping around the muscles of my arm, trying to freeze me in place. The voice in my head grew louder, promising and threatening in equal measure, telling me all the wonderful things I would experience if I simply surrendered. I thought about Corporal Vance and his terrible laughter, about Private Tolliver, dead before he understood what was happening, about Brennan on the ridge, watching us descend into the valley of death, about Gentry sitting in the rain, embracing the corruption rather than fighting it, about my own wound, small and innocent, the vector that would have made me one of them. The grenade was warm in my hand. I pulled the pin. The fortress burned behind me, and the dead lay still around me, and somewhere in the rain, survivors from the ridge were watching what might have been a victory if victory still meant anything. The grenade detonated and I felt nothing at all. But in the space between one heartbeat and the next, before the shrapnel could complete its work, I heard the voice one final time. "We will meet again, child, in the garden where all things come to rest." Then silence and darkness and the sweet release of a death that was entirely my own. The siege of Mouthra's fortress ended not with conquest but with mutual annihilation. When the relief forces finally arrived 3 weeks later, they found only ash and bone, and orders came from high above to glass the entire region from orbit. I know this because I watched them do it. Not as a living man, not as one of the corrupted dead, as something in between, a consciousness that should not have survived but did, bound to the very soil that the lance strikes were meant to purify. Grandfather is patient, his garden extends beyond a single world, and somewhere in the ashes of Mouthra, beneath the glassed and scorched earth, seeds continue to wait for their season,